We focus on Ohio State football each and every week here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. And this week, it's Friday at high noon. And as you can hear, the voice of college football, that's a term we may want to put a disclaimer on for the last few days and certainly today. But we will do our best to chug on through. And certainly we want to hear more so from these two gentlemen, Steve Hellwagon from Bucknuts 247 Sports, and also Kevin Noon from Rivals Buckeye Grove. How you boys doing today?
Doing great.
I'm doing great.
Cameron Martinez, of course, the only commitment from the early signing period who did not ink in December, but also has firmly committed that he is ready to go and will be signing this coming Wednesday, which is, of course, the traditional National Signing Day, February 5th. We will certainly cover it top to bottom, but it's pretty much lock, stock, and barrel for Ohio State. Other than Martinez, Kevin, Cameron Martinez is certainly a great get.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's a huge get. Kerry Combs had to get out there and immediately get on the recruiting trail to try and lock that down. Cameron Martinez, upon the departure of Jeff Hafley, wanted to slow things down, make sure he knew what was going on. You know, schools had certainly not given up on him, Notre Dame, Northwestern. I talked to a buddy of mine at Northwestern who said that the Cats, were going to offer him, he could play anywhere, offense, defense, hell, play quarterback. They don't have one right now. I mean, I guess Hunter Johnson, but things hadn't gone so well there. So Kerry Combs gets involved, relentless recruiter, does great in recruiting in the state of Michigan, was able to lock that down. Big news that came out that they got him locked down to play defensive back. Some questions amongst the recruiting types is, will he be able to translate completely over to corner? Is he more of a safety? What is he at this point? With Kerry Combs leading the way, I think they'll figure it out pretty quick.
Steve, your thoughts on Mr. Cameron Martinez?
Well, I think it's tremendous. And I think, again, you're getting kind of a utility player, a Swiss Army knife that can do a lot of different things. I think he was more of a runner as a quarterback than as a thrower. I think that's where a lot of people saw him at the high school level. Was an outstanding offensive player. I think Ohio State looking at him as an athlete and a safety prospect, I guess, maybe a corner. I don't know. I guess get him in and have Kerry Combs and Matt Barnes get a hold of him and work him out and see where he's going to fit in. Could be outstanding on returns. I had one guy said he'd be an outstanding slot receiver as well for Ohio State. But then you look down the list on this class, and they took 4 wide receivers, as we like to say, classically trained wide receivers, guys who are going to play that position full time. And you just wonder, is there any room at the end for a 5th guy, as an H-back or whatever. But dynamic with the ball in his hands, and still some potential for that to happen as in the return game potentially, or if things don't work out on defense and put him over on offense, I suppose. But this is an Ohio State program under Ryan Day that in my mind, and I don't mean this in any kind of a negative way, people are signing up to play offense at Ohio State in record numbers. Defense is an area where they need to continue to work as hard as they can to get the best defensive players out there. And, maybe the jury is still out a little bit on Ryan Day as a defensive recruiter. And this was an area, as much as anything, where they need bodies, given some of the things that have happened over there. And obviously when you lose, it helps to have Sean Wade back, but you lose Okuda, excuse me, Jordan Fuller and Damon Arnett, who were seniors. You knew you were going to lose them anyway. They did need to replenish a little bit on that side of the ball. So I'm excited. They had one commitment, obviously, that fell through. Was it Clark Phillips, Kevin, who exchanged and went to Utah. So in some regards, this would have been tough to lose another guy who was ticketed, so to speak, on the defensive side of the ball. So I'm excited from everything I hear that, a Michigan Player of the Year has picked Ohio State, and just from the standpoint of seeing what he can bring when he gets into the fold.
Yeah, but you bring him in at this point, and you put him on defense and say, but we'll see where you're going to end up at this point. If you sit there and you have him coming in and say, well, maybe we'll take a look at you at the slot. What does that mean for Mookie Cooper? Does Mookie Cooper look elsewhere because of that? Sometimes you just have to get all the pieces in, and then you kind of figure it out at that point. So, I think the fact, though, that Kerry Combs has gone all in, and I don't think it's just necessarily the fact that he's now, de facto Michigan recruiter again, but also because he's going to be, he's the D coordinator, will be working with the corners. I think all of that's very important. It's pretty indicative of, that they're going to give him that first look on defense. But Steve is right in saying that he truly is a Swiss Army knife and can do a lot of things well. Just going to be a matter of seeing what translates to the next level.
We got Ohio State Buckeyes Live coming your way on a Friday. The voice of college football, as you can hear. We were giving way to Kevin Noon from Rivals, Buckeye Grove, Steve Hellwagon, of course, from Bucknuts 247 Sports, as much as possible. Not that you don't want to hear more from those two gentlemen than myself on a regular basis anyway, but this just adds to that factor. We appreciate everybody jumping on the line. And, of course, we're going to be here till about 1 o'clock Eastern time. And we'll take your comments and questions straight to Steve and Kevin. Talking some Cameron Martinez, the only commitment from the early signing period who has yet to sign, but he has confirmed that commitment. Number 4 player at his position in the country, according to Rivals. Number 7, Michigan. Number 7, Michigan player from Muskegon, Michigan. 14th rated athlete, according to the 247 composite. Number 323 overall national player, Cameron Martinez. When we look at the 2020 commits, of course, again, we're looking at the best class in the Big Ten. It's not even close. Number 5 in the nation, according to 247 right now. And guys, as you look on the list, other than the obvious, just looking at the recruiting rankings, looking at the top-rated players and being excited about the number 1 or 2 guys, is there anybody down the list? Is there anybody, period, that you just have a fascination to see? We'll start with you, Kevin, in regards to seeing them this fall and maybe making an impact even as a freshman.
I mean, obviously, I think just with all the hype around the receiver class, I think that's going to be the place we're going to see somebody emerge. Is it definitely going to be Julian Fleming, the number 1 receiver in the Rivals rankings nationally for the class of 2020? I think people were going to sit there and say that, potentially it could be him, but it could be Jackson Smith-Njigba, the 5-star out of Rockwall, Texas, a Dallas suburb. He really came on as of late. I mean, G. Scott's got that college-ready body. Mookie Cooper coming in that slot position. You just never know what you're going to get there. I think it's going to be really important with both of the quarterbacks, with C.J. Stroud and Jack Miller, to see if one of those two can really emerge and pass up Gunnar Hoke as the number 2 quarterback behind Justin Fields. I think that's really important. I'm a big fan of the offensive line. I think that so much of the game is predicated by your line play, both offensive and defensive. I really want to see the growth of Paris Johnson, who comes in as a 5-star player, what he's going to be able to do, because this offensive line class that they brought in under Greg Studwara, a good mixture of guys who could be immediate guys into the 2 deep and some guys who may be some developmental guys who may need a year or two to reshape their bodies and get into a little bit more of a college frame to be able to go. But I think Paris Johnson's somebody that could step right into that 2 deep potentially. I don't think he's going to be able to push Nick Petit-Frere or DeJuan Jones necessarily in year 1 for that right tackle position, but we're certainly talking about alignment of the future. And then defensively, as I'm kind of looking at the list, I don't necessarily think he's got the quickest path to the field just based on them running the single high safety, but Lathan Ransom, the safety out of Tucson, Arizona, really excited to see him play. He's one that I've circled on my list of players that I'll be focusing on once he does enroll in the summer.
I'll throw in.
Yeah, go to it, Steve.
I'll throw in a couple guys. I had a chance to talk to Luke Whippler. I presume that's how you pronounce it, on the phone, and I think he could be an outstanding interior offensive lineman, center, guard at the college level, and was very impressed talking to him, and I think he's got a tremendous upside. I'm not sure he's going to play a whole lot as a freshman because they do have really a tremendous two deep in my mind. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across, two deep at all 5 spots, basically going into the spring and the new cycle for 2020. But I think he's a kind of a hidden gem in this class that, kind of outside the top 100 that a lot of people are looking or thinking could be a guy to keep an eye on. Darian Henry, defensive lineman, I had a lot of good comments about him. And I think the thing that kind of resonated or came back on him was he's going to be as good, as hard as he works will be commensurate with how good he's got the potential to be, if that makes any sense. And they see that the sky is potentially the limit with him if he really puts it in, could be an NFL caliber player. And Court Williams is a guy, maybe a linebacker at the high school level, maybe a safety at the college level, depending on how his body fills out. To me, there's 3 or 4 guys that, you don't have headlines about them on signing day. They're not, say national top 50 guys, but they could be very important 4 or 5 year, type players, 3 or 4 year contributors at Ohio State, maybe 3-year contributors, I guess, when you come down to it. But guys that could be in the 2 deep for 3 years, maybe start a couple years. That I look at Williams and maybe they're going to move him and have him start out at safety, and yet. When you lose after the upcoming season, the likes of Borland, Browning, Werner, and Hilliard, and then next year you lose Mitchell, Gant, and Pope, there could be some playing time for him back at linebacker if he fills out. So they got Cody Simon and Mitchell Melton as well at linebacker. So, within a year or two, some of those guys may be pressed into production.
We're going to be dissecting the 2020 Ohio State schedule here in a few minutes, but I'm going to go from the granular to like the biggest treetop topic you can possibly select, just because it hit me in regards to just somebody had mentioned in the live chat about everybody else playing for second place in the Big Ten. And for anybody under the age of like 25 who loves Ohio State football, they just consider it a birthright. Winning the Big Ten championship. And I know Ohio State has not won every Big Ten championship, but it's been as dominant as any team in any league in the country over the last 15 years. And when they haven't won the Big Ten championship, people typically still think they're the best team in the Big Ten because of certain circumstances involved in the most talented. But we've all lived through the 8-4s and the like records to that. We could go through the litany of late 80s teams, early 90s teams, and then the last few Cooper teams other than the 98 team, the 99 team that lost 6 games. So this is not automatic. What could you guys possibly see down the road that derails this thing? Because it just seems to be it's on a roll from every possible aspect.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that you just got to keep the recruiting going. You could have all this great coaching and whatnot, but if you don't have the athletes, it's really not going to matter at that point. So, Urban had this team recruiting at the next level. Ryan Day's first class, top 5 class, already has a great, I'm talking his first full class, the one that just signed or is signing on Wednesday. Already number 2 in the class of 2021 at this point. But I think if you sit there and you really look at it, it's going to take the West to step up at this point. You can sit there and look at the Big Ten East, but the Big Ten East is going to cannibalize itself to a certain extent with Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State, all on that side. I think it's going to take the West to really rise up and be the way that would knock Ohio State off its throne in terms of on the field play. And at this point, Wisconsin puts together some nice teams, but they haven't really been capable here during this stretch of knocking off Ohio State. If Ohio State trips up, it's been against Iowa. It's been against Purdue. It's been one of these games that everybody sits there in circles as a trap game. That's not going to be enough to knock off Ohio State or necessarily even the East at that point. Wisconsin or Nebraska or somebody's going to have to really put it together at this point. And none of those schools are necessarily in strong recruiting areas to where they can just sit there and put a fence around, 150 miles around where they are and say, well, we're going to ride or die with this. So, they already are at a bit of a disadvantage just based on geography at that point, and then going against the East and just getting cannibalized, just crushed over on that side. But to make the story shorter, I would sit there and say ultimately it comes down to recruiting. If Ohio State starts to falter in recruiting, if Ohio State starts losing a lot more coaches, and Ryan Day maybe make some bad hires at that point, which we haven't seen at this point, that could also be a huge role in that. But it comes down to the athletes.
Yeah, I would agree with Kevin. It is 70%, 75% recruiting at this point. As we say, the quality of the product going in is commensurate with the quality of the product coming out, and Ohio State has been able to avoid, in large part, those costly upsets. I mean, as he said, Iowa and Purdue, I wouldn't necessarily say they're outliers, but, I think that when Ohio State takes the field, they're typically anywhere from a 1 to 4 touchdown favorite over most of the teams that they play during the regular season, at least. Now, going to Oregon, this year, they're catching Oregon at a good time. And I know we're going to talk about the schedule here in a minute, but them losing Herbert, obviously, that may sit well for Ohio State as a time to go to Oregon when they're breaking in a new quarterback. But in general, what this is going to take to topple this program is a bad head coaching hire at some point, and somebody who and they've almost recruiting proofed themselves, because they are no longer dependent on the state of Ohio solely to be the backbone of this program. You go back to Tressel, half of his classes were Ohio guys. If he signed 25 guys, 12 or 13 of them were from Ohio. And,
At least.
And it was the A.J. Hawks, the Bobby Carpenters, the Maurice Clarettes, Troy Smiths, Justin Zwicks, Doug Daddish. I could go on down the line, all these guys from Ohio who ended up being 3 and 4 year guys, 2 or 3 year starters, at Ohio State, that they depended on. They're no longer dependent on the state of Ohio. In fact, they come back to Ohio and look for the top 4 or 5 guys from Ohio. I mean, Paris Johnson is a guy from Ohio. You would have taken him in 1995. You would have taken him in 2005, and you take him in 2020. I mean, that was a no-brainer. But they fall back in Ohio to complement what they're able to get outside the state of Ohio, and they've built those relationships in so many pockets of the country right now with the assistant coaches that they have, that what would short circuit this, and I can't even come up with a name of a guy who would be so undynamic as a recruiter that he would come in and the machinery would grind to a halt. The best thing Gene Smith did was to retain Ryan Day, and I say this after one season. We may think differently about this after 5 years or 3 years, depending on how the next couple of seasons go, but things seem to be, again, I did a thing last week on the site, 18 websites, 17 of them have Clemson number 1 and Ohio State number 2 for next year, and the other one has Ohio State number 1 and Clemson number 2. So if we just fast forwarded to January 11th of next year and had those two playing each other, that'd be fine with me. We'd be guaranteed our trip to Miami, Kev. How about that? That's good stuff. But, it seems to me like he's got this thing pointed in the right direction. He appears to be a very good hire. And the most important thing was by retaining him and by Urban Meyer not taking another job yet, in parenthesis, the Pantonis, the Maratis, the Voltolinis, the Quinn guy, and everybody else, from A to Z, soup to nuts, they all needed to have jobs. And they were only too happy for those guys to stay at Ohio State and keep that machinery churning. Boom, 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 boom. It's a whole machine. And so far they've kept it intact, and nobody in the Big Ten can touch them, on a consistent, if we played 100 times, Ohio State's going to win 94 of those games against all 13 of the other schools as things are constituted today.
Because I think we would all agree that aside from some of those John Cooper teams in 1993, 95, 96, 98, from about 1980, 81 in that range, when Woody left, Earl Bruce had the one big year when they almost won the national championship, and then they settled into that excuse me, everyone out there, hang with me. They settled into that 9-3 mode with Earl. And then from pretty much that time, again, except for some of the standout Cooper teams, for about 20 years, they weren't necessarily a top 5 program. They were more like a top 15 program. And what's happened in America that has impacted recruiting more than anything for me, unless you guys come up with something else in the last 20 or 25 years, are people moving west and people are moving south, population shift. That has not it's affected everybody. It's affected Nebraska. It's affected just across the board. The only 3 schools that I can think of that come close to Ohio State, and they really don't come close in the Rust Belt, would be Notre Dame, Penn State, and Michigan in regards to being able to go anywhere in the country and grab players. Ohio State, it's basically college football is the South, and I won't even say the entirety of the South. It's Clemson, Georgia, Alabama, LSU pretty much. And Ohio State, they rule college football, and LSU is just we don't know if it's going to last. Even with great respect given to the Oklahomas and, again, Michigan, Notre Dame, Penn State, they're not quite there. They can go to Florida and get some guys, but really even the better teams in the Big Ten, as Kevin alluded to, Wisconsin, they go to Florida and they get the 3rd and 4th tier guys. You know, they're getting some athletes out of there. Ohio State's able to go to Florida and California and get the top guys. Why has Ohio State been able to distinguish itself more than anybody else in the country that's not in the Deep South? It fascinates me.
It certainly doesn't hurt that now you can see any game, anywhere, anytime, pretty much on any device.
But Kevin, wouldn't you think that would work against the major powers? That would give the little guys an equal footing, that you would see more balance, but we see less balance in college football.
I know, but football's still pretty tribal in terms of that, though. When Ohio State, there's certain areas Ohio State just doesn't recruit because they're not going to be able to pull guys out of there. Ohio State, for as big as the brand is and everything else, how often do they go into Mississippi and recruit a kid? How often can they go into the state of Alabama and recruit a kid? Their success in the state of Louisiana is marginal at best. But they've been able to go into Idaho to get Tommy Togiai. They've been able to go into Utah to be able to pull some kids. Right now, nobody's staying out in California at this point, but it's Clemson that's going out and crushing it in 2021 right now with some picking up Bo Collins and some guys like that at this point. But, I think that with the fact is that now that you can see games anywhere, anytime, on all of these outlets or whatnot, it does allow for, I think it levels the playing field in certain aspects, but these kids still want to win. And they're, the programs that are winning right now are the ones you mentioned in the South and Ohio State at this point. And, you sit there and you look and you see what's going on with who's putting guys into the league, and, having ambassadors like Michael Thomas and guys like that certainly does not hurt. Nick Bosa getting the NFL Rookie of the Year more so than just defense. The overall Rookie of the Year. These guys being on the big stage. So, there's so much going into it at this point. But, ultimately, we sit there and people flip out when, a kid comes out for a visit and the team may lose. It's like, well, that's it. You got to cross them off the list. Well, kids aren't necessarily concerned with one loss at that point. But, there are not a lot of kids that are going to want to go in and go to, I'm not going to pick on any school in particular, but a school that's going 3-9 all the time. It's very difficult for one kid to completely affect the bottom line, more so than like in basketball, where if you bring in a star player in basketball, fortunes can change a lot quicker. But in football, outside of quarterback, it's a lot more difficult for one guy to be able to sit there and turn the tide.
I don't know if you've got anything on this, Steve, but I just find it fascinating, again, that we've got like 4 or 5 power brokers in the sport, and Ohio State's the one team from outside the Deep South that can be elite and arguably the best program in the country.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Kevin said. I think exposure is a big thing, and that the networks in general, even, Ohio State fans have a deep-seated hatred for ESPN, but, ESPN, to their credit, understands the importance of Ohio State, and Fox, the Fox and Ohio State brands are basically joined at the hip right now in terms of promoting one another. It seems like, I mean, you couldn't be a bigger promoter of Ohio State football right now than Fox is, and I think that some of that subliminally comes across that to people, kids, that this is a big deal. It is up there with Clemson and Alabama. And the people in Ohio treat it like a religion, and it does mean everything. And I think that when you have guys like Jordan Fuller, J.K. Dobbins, Chase Young, come from all over the country to this one location, all of them thousands of miles from home, and they're all able to attain fortune and fame playing this great game that they all love. I think in some ways it's kind of like Notre Dame may have been back in the 70s and 80s, that it's a national brand that is almost untouchable. And I think, and I don't mean to be hyperbolic about this and say crazy things, but it's just like there is something very special going on at Ohio State on an annual, year in and year out basis. We're going to go to the Combine here later in February. Kevin and I, we go every year. There's going to be another 8 or 9 Ohio State guys at the Combine. Jonah Jackson came a complete nobody, a complete no one at Rutgers, so far under the radar. Comes to Ohio State, now they're talking about him being one of the first guards taken in the NFL draft. I mean, and I'm not saying that Greg Studrawa made him a great player. I'm just saying he was put in meaningful football games against great competition, and he performed well. And people saw it, and he went to the Senior Bowl, and he played well. That's what Ohio State can do for you with the platform, the coaching, the competition, and everything that comes together with it. That's what they're selling right now to prospective recruits, and kids all over the country are only too happy to eat it up.
Steve, the television aspect of this, and Kevin, something came to mind when Steve mentioned the networks and Ohio State's power on television. If you look at the television ratings, first and foremost, Ohio State rates as well as anyone, if not better than anyone in the country, regardless, even if they're not considered the best team. The TV ratings are phenomenal. They own, again, the SEC and the Big Ten own the top 10 games in the nation every year, and Ohio State's the team in the Big Ten. In addition to that I find fascinating is that if you look at the markets, the individual TV markets that watch college football, they're all in the Deep South. If you look at the top 10, they're generally in the Deep South. There might be a sprinkling of a Dayton or a Cleveland, except for Columbus, Ohio. And Columbus, Ohio, excuse me, is either 1 or 2 or 3. And then so in regards to watching its game of interest, so the markets in Alabama, obviously watching Alabama and Auburn and so forth and so on. But in addition, that second layer of just being college football fanatics, as Steve says, Ohio State being the religion, but being fanatics of the sport. If you look at teams and games that aren't affiliated with those markets, there's still college football support in the South of them watching not just their games, but watching other teams play, and Columbus, Ohio. It's fascinating.
Yeah, you'll see big numbers for Oklahoma K-State in Columbus. Yeah. They'll put, I mean, if that ends up being the main game and
they're certainly watching, they're certainly watching Michigan and Penn State.
There was an instance this past year, and I'm going to get this dead wrong. It was like a Michigan Penn State game, and the rating was better in Columbus than it was in Detroit. And that's just, again, I'm not going to get that right. I'm sure something's wrong in there, but maybe it wasn't Penn State. I don't know. And in fact, it may have been better than Philadelphia. I mean, it's crazy that the people in Columbus, in Central Ohio, and Dayton is also scores very well per capita on this thing. Cincinnati to a degree, although it's a fractured market, and Cleveland is more of a pro city. But for the big games, their viewers turn out in droves as well. And so, it's just a football crazy state. But there was a game this past year involving Michigan. I want to say it was Michigan and Penn State, where the Columbus rating was as good or better than Detroit and maybe Philadelphia as well, which just kind of just tells you how sick these people are in a good way.
Yeah.
I had hyped our discussion on the 2020 schedule, but I don't believe we have enough time to do it justice. Also, would love to get Tony Gerdeman's thoughts on this, and know Kevin needs to move along as well. So we'll move that to next week when we talk 2020 schedule, highlighted by the trip to Eugene, Oregon. David Whalen, a great friend of the channel here. We appreciate your comment. Like, comment, subscribe, and enjoy. Everybody else on the line, including Cheryl, of course, our great supporter right there on Ohio State football and all our live streams. Talking Ohio State football with Steve Hellwagon from 247 Sports Bucknuts. Please join him right there, as well as Kevin Noon and Rivals Buckeye Grove. As I scan anything else in, I don't want to miss any comments and questions, since we typically I had asked for people to bring us anything that they've got. Most of this is just comments based on our conversation about Ohio State's brand and recruiting prowess and staying elite in college football. All right, guys, we appreciate you stopping by. I don't know that I think this is a good stopping point. I don't see anything else in the live chat. And again, I think we want to do the 2020 schedule full justice, and hopefully we'll have Tony next week as well.
Good deal.
Appreciate everybody jumping on the live chat. Kevin, again, Buckeye Grove, join him there. Steve Hellwagon has been so gracious to post these videos on 247 Sports Bucknuts, so join him right there as well. We will see everybody soon. We've got Miami football talk coming up at 2 o'clock Eastern time, so please join us for that. See everybody later.
Yep. Thursday